tomorrow we're going to work on getting better at painting forms, and one of the easiest ways to do that is, well, to practice, but one of the easiest ways to do that for me anyway, and I think it's probably the most traditional way, is to break it into, basically you break it into blocks of color and color blocks. So what I did here is I just quickly kind of sketched out the general shape, and then I decided I was going to paint around it, which is something I sometimes do when I'm doing like an individual kind of shape. I don't know, I feel like it kind of helps just define it even more. So I kind of carved the shape out of the pear, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to block it into basically two values. I'm gonna split it into a two-tone. I'm going to make it one light color and one dark color, and kind of just map out the generalities of the pear. Like, basically, if I had to choose, if, in class we always talk about if you squint at the object, that helps you narrow down the values. And so I kind of was squinting to see where the light would be and where the dark would be. And what we're going to do in class is I have a whole bunch of, obviously, plastic fruit and vegetables. I have flowers. I have a bunch of new animals, like figurines. But if you're watching this at home, you could, if you're doing this at home, you could do anything. You could do a real pear. You could do a ball. You could do a figurine. You could do, anything simple-ish, and just do this exercise with any number of forms. And again, form is a visual element of art, one of the 7 visual elements. And it's what happens when, if I would have left this just a silhouette of a pear with just one color, one value, it would be a shape. And when we start adding shadow, light and shadow, and it becomes 3D, that's called form. So this is my first pass, the first thing I did. So I basically had that first dark and light. And now what I'm doing is I'm going to go in, now that I have that two-tone, and I'm going to start adding more highlights and more mid-tones, and also complicating the shadows a little bit. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned the yellow I mixed to darken it to the shadowy part, the shaded part, was a little bit of purple is what I decided. I always tend to go, when I'm darkening, with the complementary color, and the complementary color of yellow is violet. So I think that's what I was mixing with. But then I decided I was going to redden it a little bit more and add a little bit more kind of a little more complicated kind of analogous tones to this. So I started adding a little bit of earth tones and a little bit of orangey earth tones, and I'm happy with the final product. So then I went to one of my figurines and sketched it out also. This one I didn't paint out because it's a little more complicated, but even though it's a more complicated object, I also tried to stick with this idea of having two tones, and for the first pass, to really map out where the light and the darkness is, and where the shadow and the light is. And so this figurine, I really just kind of did the two tones. I did the basic kind of fur tone, and then I did a dark shadow tone for this one. Very contrasty. And then I would go in, as soon as I have this basic form duo tone form in, I started adding a few more. Sorry, this is me still basically doing this tone. Then I start adding some lighter highlights for where the light is hitting it the most, and I started adding some mid-tones, and then it starts getting a lot more complicated, feels a lot more 3D. So the more I kind of play with how light and shadow is hitting the object, and that's all I'm looking at of my object that I'm painting, is where the light is and where the shadow is, and I'm trying to recreate those shapes. And by doing that, it just emerges. If you kind of are continually, so like you go from the bigger shapes, like the duo shapes, and then you get smaller and more minute and more complicated. So that's kind of how a form emerges. So now I'm kind of adding more and more nuance. I'm adding more and more different value levels, I'm adding more and more colors. So it's just, you start vague in general and with the two-tone, and then you keep going more detailed, more different, a wider range, and a more complicated range of colors, and then that's kind of how it emerges. And I'm happy enough with the lion, and I quickly painted in the background, and you'll notice it kind of pops. I was happy with that color choice. Yeah, and so again, form is, if you follow the process, start with big shapes and a big contrast in value, and then start getting more details and more details and more nuance and more different value scales, then you really end up with a 3D feeling object as opposed to a silhouette. So yeah, we wind up with a lion, a fully formed lion. So we're going to try a little more, even more complicated, and flowers can be really complicated. I'm going to sketch it out and start with a really, really basic shape, and just kind of one value actually for this one. Just kind of get the whole shape of the carnation in there. And I realized it wasn't the right, it was a little too warm, so I went in with a different red. And now I'm just going to start really trying to map out. For this, it's a little harder to do the two-tone, but I'm still keeping it very general, very simple for the first pass. I'm just kind of highlighting various shapes of lightness that I'm seeing. And then I'll start going in and adding more details to that. The best way always to break down a complicated thing is to, I suppose that's probably in like everything, right? Like to simplify it. Again, to make it darker, I'm occasionally adding a little tiny bit of green in there to make it desaturate it a little bit and darken it a little bit. And I'm also mixing in some different reds. So I don't think I mentioned in a lion, I was pretty much just using dark kind of, I think it was like a dark green mixed with burnt umber and a lot of raw sienna. So it's hard to paint a carnation because there's so much kind of like waviness on the shape and the shadows. So yeah, so then I wanted to also obviously get form on the stem as well, so I kept it pretty two-tone, and I went back in and made more shadow. So and you'll see me, I keep holding up my brush to the flower to match the color. And I do that a lot with any any object I'm trying to match. I hold my brush with the paint that I think might be the right color up onto it to confirm whether it's too light, too dark, too warm, whatever. Yeah. And so that's what we're going to be doing tomorrow. We're going to do multiple objects. If you have like an idea for like a tabletop painting or a still life you'd like to do of your own objects, definitely stage something and take a picture. We can do that. Otherwise, I'll have lots of things for you to paint. It's really going to be practicing this important skill. I've been noticing sometimes it's a little flat. Yeah, this is a good example of ruining a painting because I really like it here at this stage where it's really dark, and I went too much, I went too far, and I also went too light in the stem. So you can watch me ruin a painting right now. But yes, so we're going to be working on form tomorrow, and I think it'll be great practice. Okay, bye.